The last night in the abandoned office is the one I can't stop thinking about, because something I thought I left sealed behind that glass and those locked doors found me on the walk home. My name is David. I change locks for a living, but I don't do normal locks. I do night jobs nobody wants to advertise, empty factories that leak heat, storage towers with sagging roofs, office buildings that developers have promised will be redeveloped for 5 years running. I take them because they pay in cash, because the hours are wrong for anyone with a conventional life, and because the kinds of jobs I take come with 2 advantages. You're mostly alone, and nobody checks the books if you clock out on time. That anonymity is useful, except when what you're keeping winded and alive is older than the ledger keeping it. The contract was delivered through a courier I'd met once in a diner on the edge of town. He left a folding folder with a single sheet clipped and a tiny pad of cash folded inside, enough to make the trip worth it, plus an extra night's rent. He didn't offer a receipt. He did, however, pause at the van's taillight, hand me the folder, and say under his breath, "Check the cameras. Don't let it see you." Then he left the way the city moves at 2 in the morning. Quick, forward, an economy of motion. The place was an old office tower on the wrong side of downtown, a stepped rectangle of concrete and glass that had been hiring agencies, call centers, and insurance underwriters before everything migrated online. Now it had an official for lease sign dangling like a loose tooth, and a service entrance padlocked behind a chain-link fence. The main doors were nailed from inside with plywood and spray paint. There was a generator out back with a tarp over it, a metal stairwell that smelled like rust and old cigarettes, and a back alley full of the kind of trash councils ignore. I brought a pack, a headlamp, a toolbox, and a propensity for checking fuse panels before anyone else touched the main feeds. The day crew had taped a handwritten sheet on the security room door. Main feed OK, HVAC OK, backup test at 2000. Someone had scrawled, in smaller letters, a date from 32 years ago, and underneath, a name, J. Mallory. The handwriting looked like it had been traced over dozens of times. Inside, the building was skeletal. Floor after floor of empty cubicles, their fabric panels sun-faded, a forest of dust outlining where screens used to glow. The carpet squished under my boots like bread long kept in damp. Office plants were dead statues in pots. The break room still had a coffee pot the color of old tea and a fridge magnet advertising a real estate company that no longer existed. The server closet hummed at the end of a long corridor, rows of black boxes and racks, a rectangular blue sticker that said "Keep batteries cool" in block letters.
The security room had a bank of monitors, cold and black, a keyboard with missing keys, and a chair that remembered somebody's spine. I wrote my initials and the time on the logbook the crew left, 10:07 p.m. Then I began the rounds the way a person becomes their own ritual. Lights, cameras, HVAC, generator, record. Check the relays, flip the backup switches, make sure the motion detectors are dusted and free of cobwebs. The building accepted my list like a sleeping animal accepting a hand. There were 2 things that made the night different from the first 3 I'd done there. One was Joey. Joey turned up the second week, as night people do, absolutely certain and unavoidably loud when most things were designed to be whispered. He introduced himself as Joseph H. Mallory, and then, by habit, as Joey, as if names were a string he pulled until one caught. He called the place Our Watch, like we were crew on a ship rather than 2 temp workers trying to keep fluorescent lights from frying transformers. He carried a battered satchel full of paper, photocopied maps, lists with decades of dates, and a little spiral notebook with a bent cover that looked like it had been dragged through at least one basement flood. "You chase wiring, I collect history," he told me the first night, spreading a map of the building across the security desk. The map had annotations, dates in blocky pencil, arrows to vents, circles around oddities. "This building used to be the Argus Tower," he said. "Names change, the thing underneath doesn't." He was talkative in the way people get when they've made a fence out of words and are inviting you to climb over it. He smelled like cheap cologne and coffee. His jacket had a smudge of grease on the cuff. He told stories as though the facts were a string of beads he could pull one after another to make something glittering and monstrous. He never asked for my name until I told him, and when I did, he nodded like someone who has been collecting names in empty buildings for a while. The other thing was the manual. I found it by accident, wedged under a stack of delivery invoices in the security room. The cover was a blue plastic folder, glue worn at the spine, and inside were pages with typed headings and an arrangement of short imperative sentences that read like training protocols and like prayers. The top page was titled Keeper's Manual. Someone had printed it on a dot matrix in the mid-80s, and then refreshed it page by hand and then by printer again. The rules were simple. They were mechanical. They were meant to be obeyed in the same way you obey a safety harness. 1. Maintain light and sight. Keep cameras functional. Replace burned bulbs immediately. 2. Do not let it hear your name. Silence phones in designated zones. 3. Avoid direct eye contact with silhouettes. Do not follow them. 4. Seal vents after hours when instructed. Check for residue. 5. If voices come over PA, do not respond. Note the content in time.
6. When silhouettes pass, extinguish interior lights until monitors clear. 7. Keep a physical log. If you find prior logs, copy the dates and the times. The cycle repeats. There were annotations in different inks. Someone had underlined, "Do not let it hear your name," and written in cramped letters, "It learns names like keys." Another hand had scribbled a single crossed-out word and replaced it with the word seal, then circled it twice. It could have been superstition, and maybe it was. The manual read like a union of old electrician's rules and something older, passed down from one tired keeper to the next. The rules were practical. Lights keep the cameras working. Cameras keep you aware of corridors you can't see. But the wording suggested that the protocols were also designed not to annoy some intelligence. Which intelligence? The pages didn't say. They only said the building had been kept because someone, once, decided the alternative was worse. We joked about it at first. We're workers. We mock mantras to make them manageable. Joey called the manual a seal. I called it preventative maintenance. We both checked the cameras. Always check the cameras, the manual said. So I did. I dusted each dome and peered up into blackened lenses. The cameras were old, analog domes that had been replaced with newer models in other places, but they still sent a feed to the monitor bank. Most times the feed was what you expected. Dark halls, empty cubicle rows, the wash of a streetlight through a high window. Sometimes the feed had blips, static that resolved into a smear like a thumbprint on glass. The smear would be just there and then gone. Not a distortion from the electronics, but from something that might have moved through space. The first time I saw something that tried to be a shape, it was on monitor 3, a low-resolution hallway where the grain of the image rearranged itself like a watch spring catching. For half a second, the geometry of a person, head, shoulders, was clear, walking down an aisle between cubicles that were merely stacked with dust. Then the pixels collapsed, and all I had was a dark streak. On the next pass, the hallway was empty. I wrote it in the log, 11:14 p.m., Cam 3 anomaly, cleared, documented. I had the professional instinct that recorded incidents were less likely to become stories. Data is a stabilizer. Camera 3 misses things, Joey said when I showed him. He drank his coffee like it was an argument fuel. Glitches are a kind of lie. He tapped the monitor. Sometimes the feed is a different corridor. Sometimes it's a corridor that doesn't exist on any floor plan. He smiled, not unkindly. We're paid to notice lies. We began to keep a secondary log, the way people set plastic bowls at their feet for leaks. It was a book he kept inside his satchel, and he wrote in it with a careful, almost ceremonial hand. Dates, times, small, exacted phrases from the PA.
The manual's rule about keeping a physical log was short. Joey's notebooks were long, like diaries stitched onto blueprints. For the first few weeks, these anomalies were contained to the monitors and the static corners of the building. There were voices, thin and misrouted, that came through the speakers in the stairwells or the small emergency intercoms where someone had left a test patch cable. Voices that said a name sometimes, not mine, Linda or Carlos, as though searching for a particular desk. We logged them, and then we counted days until the next one. The pattern was patchy. A month with nothing. A night where every speaker in the stairwell sang a chorus of old office greeting card jokes. The manual said, if voices come, do not respond. The manual did not say whether the voices would eventually learn to make different jokes. There was a smell that moved between floors. It was not rot in the obvious way, but a metallic, oil-sweet tang that clung to fabric. It smelled like burnt insulation and stale coffee, like the building's history condensed into a scent. It pooled under the vents when the HVAC kicked. We took pictures of the vents and found under certain grates a thin black residue on the metal edges, like the residue from a flood of engine oil dried into a lace pattern. The residue was not slime exactly. It had a matte, tactile quality. You could smell the tang from across the hall. We started to time things. Joey loved timing things. He drew a line through his notebook for each event and then counted forward. He told me about old dates he'd found in other logs, a string of incidents in 1963, a cluster in 1989, another in 2007.
He kept saying the same cadence the older notes had echoed, 40 to 60 years between the real spikes. The building might remember seasons in a human lifespan. That made things feel older than occupational hazard. It made them cyclical. The epistolary pages were the worst kind of proof, uneasy and intimate. I found one notebook tucked in the back of a cabinet in the mailroom. It was a binder of someone designated as a keeper in 1979, the plastic sleeves yellow at the edges. There was a handwritten note that read in hurried script, "They come through the air flues. Do not look at them when they walk. They prefer to be counted in silence." Another entry, dated May 12, 1989, tried to block the vents. It learned the seams. The lights flickered for half an hour, then it smelled like pennies. Joey called me a fool. I lasted 3 nights. The name at the bottom was smudged, as if the pen had been pressed into paper by someone with a glove on. We copied the dates and the times into our log and placed our own note next to them. Verified. Physical residue. We kept the binder in the security room like a talisman, though we both knew the kind of talismans that matter are not objects, but behaviors. A sealed vent, a light left burning, a camera lens wiped clean.
When the building's systems besides the cameras began to fail, small diagnostic errors at first, we tightened our adherence to the rules. The server rack would reboot, and when it came back up, that particular camera would show a hallway from a different floor, or an office that had been demolished in 2003. Sometimes the backup generator would spin for 4 seconds and then die. Sometimes the lights would dim for no recorded trigger. All of this we cataloged. All of it made the manual look less like a quaint doc and more like a set of practical instructions from people who had figured out, by trial and error, that there were behaviors which invited fewer consequences. Rules are comforting. They are what you read when you don't want to think about causes and effects and whether anything that knows your name will respect building codes. So we followed them. We did the math on bulbs, replaced the fluorescents on the 3rd and 5th floors, inspect the ceiling tiles for recent movement, tape the vents on nights of anomalous feed. I took on the mechanical jobs, the fuses, the HVAC checks, the grease on the generator, because my hand was trained to like the friction of physical things. Joey did the reading. "Call it a seal if it helps," he said one night when we taped vents around the server room. "Call it infrastructure if that's easier. History says the same thing whichever name you use. Keep sightlines open, or whoever loved this building first will come back with a hunger for its light." "I'm better with breakers than metaphors," I told him, and we laughed in the way people do when the whole room is lit by emergency strips, and the laugh is a way to give your throat traction. Small things started happening that the manual had explicitly warned about. Phones rang in corners where no phones were plugged in. The elevator sometimes stopped between floors, and when it did, the PA system would accidentally play back recorded messages that weren't in the system storage. Once, on a night I was working late and Joey had left, a voice came over the building's intercom that said a single name. David. It was flat, like it had been recorded a long time ago and then slowed. It said only the name and then a long silence. I sat very still in the security room with the monitors at low light, and my own name vibrating like a bell in a hollow. I logged it. 02:32 a.m. PA call. Name. No response. No active call trace. The manual said, "Do not let it hear your name." It didn't say what happened if it did. It didn't need to. The margins were where people put warnings that were harder to quantify. A circled warning that said, "Names are keys," in a hand I couldn't place. The old binder in the mailroom had an entry that read in all caps, "If it hears, it learns. Do not speak a name." I began to sleep badly. Not the kind of bad where you wake tired, but the kind where you wake with your head full of patterns you cannot place. Floor plans overlaid with spiralized vents, the pattern of light bulbs in an office ceiling mapped like iris segments. I found myself counting light positions when I walked across empty floors. Joey did the same in a different way. He would hum a phrase if he thought the building's sound field favored us. He called it keeping the human cadence, and I called it useless superstition. But when the PA called my name, I stopped saying my name in the building for a week. We started to notice how the infrastructure itself shifted its behavior in the presence of certain phenomena. Lights dimmed when the feed showed a shadowed procession on a monitor. Monitors would display a corridor that didn't exist, but when rewound showed a line of office silhouettes walking shoulder to shoulder, not quite touching the floor as though some gravity was optional. If you switched the room lights off when the silhouettes passed, the monitors would clear. That was a rule. It was also proof that the building obeyed certain conditional commands, like a poorly programmed automaton, or that obeying the rule convinced whatever watched that the building was still in charge. One night, during a late inspection of the 5th floor, I found a ceiling tile pushed aside. The void above was the familiar tangle of ducts and conduit, but this tile had a smear along its edge,
black, dry, scaled in the way oil dries on old machinery. There were fibers trapped in it. When I touched a tiny corner with a latex glove, it came away in my fingertips like the flaking of a paint layer. My skin smelled of it afterward. For 3 days, my gloves retained the smell. Seal the tile. The manual makes the most banal sentence into an order that is also prayerful. We taped it and noted it and told ourselves the residue would be cleaned during the next maintenance cycle. The residue did not care for our timetables. Joey found an old payroll stub in a drawer the following week, with a stamp dated 1963 and the initials of a supervisor whose name matched one of the signatures above in the 1979 binder. People are a continuity here, he said, like a historian making an observation that doubled his consolation. The building has its staff, even if the staff gets replaced by ghosts. He used the word ghost casually, folding it into a sentence as though Namish diminished it. He loved names like talismans but feared the wrong sort of attention. It was probably from paying attention that we noticed the camera's blind spots. Not because the lenses were dead, but because certain angles refused to feed back when something passed in the periphery. We rewired a camera to cover a hallway, and for 37 seconds the feed showed a pile of cardboard and the shadow of an exit sign.
Then the camera feed blinked, and the monitor showed the same hallway, but from an angle below the floor, as if the camera had burrowed through panels and was watching from a duct. When we traced the cable, it snapped in my hand like a dead vine. The wire looked damp at the end, and a residue clung to the copper like the residue under the vent grates. We were getting better at cataloging what to do. We were also learning how brittle that catalog was. It happened on a Wednesday night that the generator hiccuped at 01:46. The building shrugged and then centralized into a hum. When the lights went dim for the half minute, the monitors came alive with a procession. Silhouettes moving through corridors, their motion too steady, like dancers linked to a slow gramophone. The PA clicked, and then a voice that sounded like a woman from a voicemail years ago recited a sequence of numbers that matched a timestamp in one of the old logs. 0433, 1963, echoed like a looped sample. The manual's rule, when silhouettes pass, extinguish interior lights, was the first thing I thought of, and I moved faster than I had known my joints could move. We shut the breakers in the security room. The monitors stripped to static. The hum swallowed the sound of shoes on carpet. For a moment, I felt like someone who had turned the roof down over a candle. When the lights came back, one of the monitors had a new image. The loading dock, where no one stood 3 minutes before, now had wet shoe prints on the concrete as if a worker had stepped directly from a puddle into the dry floor. The prints were glossy, and then, in 30 seconds, they blurred at the edges and faded as though dissolving into the ground. Joey took a photo on his phone and then, without fanfare, wrote the time in his notebook and underlined it. "These patterns repeat," he said. "We're not the beginning or the end. We're caretakers." "Caretaker of what?" I asked. He tapped a column of dates he'd compiled and smiled faintly. "Of a schedule. Machines wear out, people move on. This sort of thing doesn't want the building to forget it." He was fragile in the way that belief sometimes makes people. When you make your life out of noticing, your noticing becomes an armor that needs polishing. We both assumed containment. We assumed that if you did the rituals, checked lights, taped vents, did not answer PA messages, you were safe. Protecting the cycle with a checklist felt like a negotiated peace. The building kept the thing because someone had designed protections, and we kept those protections because they were cheap. The manual read like a labor contract with the unknown. The escalation crept when routines began to break in pieces instead of as a single failed system. A camera that had never failed blinked to a close-up of a hand pressed against glass, except the hand had no detail, no fingernails, no joint creases, only a suggestion of shape. The PA, scheduled to broadcast a recorded safety reminder at 03, instead played the last voicemail message ever recorded on an in-house line from 1979. It said, in an unremarkable voice, "Tell Janet I'll be late," and then static. When I rewound the recording, I could hear a second voice under it, almost in counterpoint, a low noise that could be seashell static or someone mouthing the syllables of a calendar. The air in the stairwell grew colder. There were nights when the drafts moved like someone walking too close behind me. When I checked the vents, I sometimes found them warm to the touch in a way that suggested someone had been breathing on them recently. Once, inside a floor grate near the mailroom, I found a length of cable bundled into a shape like a tendon, slick, black, and filamentous. It was not a cable in the normal sense. It had the texture of braided synthetic fibers fused with something else. I swore under my breath and wrapped it in a rag. It left my hands senselessly cold. The manual's rule, "Beware the thing in the ducts," seemed less metaphorical and more like a warning scrawled on a storm shutter. We began to take duct inspections seriously, and the ducts, in return, began to show us more of their insides.
Tiles pushed up, conduit loosened, and there was the sense of something using the conduits to pass through the building like a river makes channels through stone. Joey called the phenomenon the drifting. He used nautical metaphors the way his map folders use dates, as if moving the building into sea terms would reveal better charts. It moves through the infrastructure, he said, tracing a finger along a photocopied floor plan. Like currents, sensors pick it up as a pressure change. The cameras catch silhouettes. The vents carry residues. You don't stop currents, you redirect them. He smiled, proud. You could hear in his voice that he preferred the idea of redirection to the idea of containment being broken. We kept cycles of sleeping and waking. I learned to sleep with the lights on in the security room because the monitors were an anchor. I learned to leave my phone silent in the parking lot because the manual said to silence phones in designated zones. The building's speakers sometimes took cell call fragments and rearranged them into phrases that felt like invitations. I learned the locations of the cameras by the way the space felt different, from a corner you expect to be empty to a corner that felt observed. I did not expect anything to follow me home. There's a point where a job feels like a job, and then a point where it becomes a ledger against sanity. The change is not a single event, it's a folding, a series of little irregularities that crease into a larger change. The first crease was a smear on my boot when I locked up after a night shift. I thought it was grease from the generator or something scuffed from the stairwell. It was black and oily and smelled like the residue under the vent grates.
I wiped it with a napkin and threw the napkin in the dumpster behind the building. I told myself not to think about it. Joey noticed the smear when he came by the security room the next night, hands full of photocopies and trace paper. "You were on the 5th, weren't you?" he asked. I shrugged. "Generator check. Battery rotation." He looked at the smear like someone examining the edge of a coin. "The residue doesn't come off all the way sometimes," he said. "Keep it away from cloth. It likes fabric." "I'll wash my jacket." I meant it as a practical answer. He nodded as though the practical answer was the right one, but not the only one. We went back to work. The manual kept us steady, like a rope you hold while crossing a stream. But ropes fray, especially in buildings that have been holding something back for decades. The fray begins where people forget to feed the rope, or when the load becomes heavier than usual. There were nights when the load was heavy, the generator failed, the camera feeds blinked into different corridors, and the PA suffused the stairwell with a chorus of disembodied muttering that sounded like a meeting someone had held and then erased. On one of those nights, as rain began to thicken the alley behind the building made a small, precise move. The HVAC, normally a soft bellow in the ceiling, hiccuped and then pushed a gust of chilled air out of a vent in the corridor like a breath. It carried with it not simply the smell of old coffee, but a faint, almost human odor, sweat, and the sweetness of something like rusted pennies. The monitors snapped to a live feed of the corridor. On the screen, there were at least 7 silhouettes walking with a slow, determined gait. "Lights," Joey said. Not loudly, not quite. It was the kind of sentence that had become protocol, extinguishing interior lighting when silhouettes pass. We did, and the monitor image dissolved into static. When the lights came back after the generator resumed, the corridor on the monitor was empty and wet with the sheen of something that might have been water or might have been oil. There were prints on the floor that started far outside the frame and ended suddenly in the middle of the hall, as if the line of silhouettes had paused at that exact point and then lifted their feet out of the usual friction. 40 to 60 years, Joey murmured, checking his notebook. It should be quiet for a while now. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that schedules and human rituals steadied such things, that following the checklist was meaningful against a pattern that had no human architect. Sometimes the belief was an act of desperation and not faith. We told ourselves we were just caretakers, doing a job, and the manual reduced strange phenomena to tasks. It made the night rentals more tenable. So I continued to do the job. I kept the lights checked, the cameras wiped, the vents sealed on the nights the reading spiked. I logged everything, the good, the bad, the things that should not be. I made photocopies of old entries and tucked them into a folder labeled with the building's name, the way people put their names on borrowed books. The city outside moved on, indifferent to the hum of the servers and the way the building breathed when no one was in it. And then one night, I found a smear on the inside of my jacket pocket. It was the same flat, matte residue we'd been finding under vents, only in a crescent shape, like a thumbprint. I did not remember putting my hand there, and the pocket had been zipped. When I opened it, the edges of the fabric around the smear had faintly stiffened, as if dried and then softened again. The smell was faint, but my throat tightened when I noticed it. It was like smelling a place you'd once slept and then left for a long time.
I sat with my hand under the light in the security room and turned the jacket inside out and then back again, and wondered if this was the kind of thinking that marks someone as broken, tracing small prues and then concluding they are tracks of something that moved. Joey was poring over a sheet of dates that night and hummed without looking up. He was the sort of man who took small noises as news. He looked up finally, and when his eyes met mine, his smile was gone. "You have to be careful with jackets," he said. "They keep you warm, they keep things close." He meant the sort of things that tuck into pockets, receipts, lint, memories. He might have meant something else, the way people mean when they are trying to keep danger from being a thing that everyone sees. When I left the building that night, I took my jacket with me. I walked the usual block to the bus stop. The city had an odor of rain and exhaust. Somewhere a bar was spilling laughter into the street like liquid. I felt watched and felt foolish for feeling watched. The thing about carrying a job home is that belongings carry the job with them. I slept poorly that night, and when I woke in the thin light of morning, I found on my kitchen table a single smear of black along the rim of my coffee cup. It happened so small and so ordinary that I convinced myself it was a transfer from something else. The rim of the cup, the corner of a newspaper, the zipper of my bag. But the residue had a pattern, a jagged microtext of dried filaments, and when I lifted the cup to my nose, I tasted nothing and smelled everything, burnt insulation and old coffee, and the hairs on my arms lifted. The manual was still at the security desk in its blue plastic folder. I had left it there like a shared conscience. I carried a copy of a couple of its pages in my head, the way people carry a hymn. Rule 1, Rule 2. The rules were supposed to protect the building, the people in it, the watchers. They were not instructions for a life beyond the watch. I am a practical man. I tell myself I can account for most of the world in circuits and pipe diagrams.
But there are things that abide by other logics. Diet of light, appetite for attention, curiosity about names. I had been careful as any sane person would be when told not to say his name into a speaker. I had followed the manual. I had tucked the residue of responsibility into a plastic bag and believed that would be enough. And then the small things started to gather like a rumor prepared in the dark. My apartment's light switch flickering when I stood beneath it, though the building's breakers were in order. A voicemail that played a single, flat greeting in another man's voice that sounded oddly like the voice from the PA system the previous week. A damp spot on the inside of my closet door where a smear had collected in a crescent, like a thumbprint. Each of these could be explained away by city life and electrical quirks. Each of these put together felt like a hand fencing me into a pattern I did not want. The last night I worked in that building was not supposed to be noteworthy. I had been paid ahead to do a final rotation before a buyer took a look and possibly converted the tower into condos. The contract was a clean one-page thing. The courier had smiled as though he knew the tidy ending would be believable. I took the night because the rent needed paying and because turning my back on the work felt like leaving a job unfinished. When I turned the key in the security room that night, the monitors blinked awake like birds. The logbook told me the month, the date, the last entries. Joey was there early with his satchel and a new sheaf of photocopies. He looked paler than usual, and I thought of all the nights we had shared the light and not the darkness. "You shouldn't have to be the one to clean final watches," he said, but he kept his voice steady like a technician. "We do what the contracts demand," I said, "and then we take the money." He laughed, and the sound was small. "We're caretakers, that's what I say until it stops sounding noble." He slid a small note across the desk. It was blank except for a time, 02:17 a.m. The ink looked like it had been dampened and dried again. I looked at my tools, the way a man looks at the line of implements that keep his hands useful. The building settled around us like an animal folding in on itself. The monitors made patterns of empty corridors. The manual in the folder had the same old rules, their short, imperative sentences, like a set of lock codes. We began the last night the same way we had every other. A walkthrough, a run of the lighting, a sweep of the cameras. We checked the generator at 2300 and ran a simulated power loss to test the batteries. We sealed a vent on the third floor that had been showing a pattern of residue. We checked the mailroom for lingering notes. We logged every action, our handwriting a careful record for something that might outlast our bones. At 0146, the generator hiccuped, the way it had before. The monitor stuttered. The PA went quiet. For 37 seconds, we watched a procession on one of the feeds, slow silhouettes moving in step down a hallway in a corridor pattern I'd seen before. We cut the lights as we had been trained. The figures cleared. When the lights came back, the corridor on the monitor was empty. There were prints again on the concrete. It was then that the building made a movement I cannot forget. A sound like the metal skin of the tower flexing under some pressure came from the ceiling above the server room. The overhead lights flickered, not as a power hiccup, but as if something was thinking about entering brightness. A vent in the ceiling above the security room shivered, and then expelled a breath that smelled of pennies and burnt coffee.
In a moment of professional curiosity more than courage, I leaned toward the vent and looked up. There was a shape in the duct above us, not quite filling the opening and not quite absent. It was a braided bundle of something, cables, fibers, a mass that looked like a tendon made of wiring, looping through the air like a hand in mid-gesture. It moved with the deliberate patience of something used to waiting for things to go out of the way. Joey swore under his breath and reached for the manual, as if sheer text could command the thing to obey. He read a line aloud, low and clipped. "If voices come over PA, do not respond." The duct exhaled. The bundle twitched. We were both trained in rules. We both had them in our bones. The building had always answered to the rules, but sometimes rules are a method of small appeasements. The thing in the duct was not obeying. It was studying. We did what the manual suggested. We did not speak or name it. We did not reach for the duct. We did the things that had kept us breathing. Switch off lights when silhouettes pass. Hold the line on the camera feeds. Copy the dates for the logs. We taped the tile down and recorded the event in the ledger with the hand that trembled a fraction. When I walked out that night, the rain had begun in earnest. The alley reeked of the city's wet metal. My jacket in the back of the van carried the faint scent of the residues, like a letter from the building. I told myself, as I locked the van and shouldered my pack, that I would wash the jacket thoroughly in hot water and keep my life separate from my job. I told myself this, a way people tell themselves bedtime stories. I went home. I took off my boots on the mat and saw a smear on the toe, and in the smear was a pattern that looked like a fingerprint curved into a crescent. I wiped it with a rag and told myself it was grease. I put the jacket in the washing machine and ran it through the hottest cycle I could, but when I fished it out, the seam of the pocket had a faint, stiff edge that resisted water. I cursed and scrubbed again, poured bleach, ran it twice, and by the time the sun was complaining against the tips of the buildings, the pocket had become, in my mind, a tiny bruise.
I thought of all the rules and lists I had obeyed. I thought of the ledger. I thought of the manual left in the security room with its mandate and its lined paper. A small, unreasonable part of me had begun to hope that if you followed the list with enough devotion, then the thing would stay within the building's skin and not cross thresholds that weren't supposed to be crossed. That night, I found a message in my phone when I checked it at 03:12 a.m. It was a voicemail, truncated and half-muted, that played a breathy sound and then a word that could have been my name if you leaned into it. The playing stopped as if the sound had been cut off by a hand. I listened to it 3 times before I realized I was not hearing something but being made to hear it. The manual had said, "Do not let it hear your name." I had done my best. I had kept my mouth shut in stairwells and in front of mics. I had written no more than initials in the ledger on nights when my pulse felt too loud for the room. But the voicemail at 03:12 a.m. was not asking for permission. It was practicing the shape of my name inside my phone with a patience that suggested it had been rehearsing for a very long time. "Stay with me. There's one night you won't want to skip." I listened to the message again in the dark, thumb hovering over the delete key like a man who keeps the blade of a knife against a rope. The sound at the start was a breath. The rest resolved into a syllable that might have been my name if you let the cadence fill out in your head. It cut off as if someone had turned the speaker off from the other end of the line. I called Joey. The line rang through and went to voicemail. His little icon didn't move. I biked back to the building in a rain that smelled like iron. The alley was slick and the city distant. The tower leaned in, its windows dull as the eyes of closed shops. I have keys for doors and keys for habits, and I used both when I slipped under the service door and climbed the stairs. The security room light was a narrow rectangle on the concrete stair as I reached the second-floor landing. The door was closed. The logbook lay open on the desk. Joey's handwriting was at the top of the page, quicker than usual. Below it, an entry that stopped mid-sentence. There was a smear of something black across the corner of the desk where his elbow had rested. His satchel was gone. His notebooks lay fanned near the monitor bank with a single page folded over, a photocopy of a payroll stub from 1963, and underneath it a line of numbers Joey had been tracing since we found the binder. Dates, times, repetitions. On the last page he had scribbled, in all caps, 3 words I recognized from the old binder. If it hears, learns. The monitors showed their usual static. A handful of feeds were dead. One of the larger screens showed, briefly and against all technical reason, the corridor outside the mailroom. On it, A procession moved, silhouettes, the edges like charcoal smudges, shoulders aligned not quite on the floor, but like something that had learned how to walk without steadying itself on gravity. They were slow, deliberate. Then the feed flicked to black. I checked the server rack. The front panel was warm in the place your hand wants to find reassurance. A cable had been chewed clean through near the patch bay. The fiber end was ragged and damp. The smell around it was that same burned insulation, stale coffee tang. I put on gloves and reached for the manual like an amulet. Joey's last neat notation was circled twice, 02:17 a.m. I wrote the time beside it and underlined it, as though ink could reinforce the meaning of a moment. The building's behavior sharpened after that. Lights that had been reliable dropped out in groups. A bank of overhead fluorescents on the 4th floor gave up a cough and went dark. The stairwell emergency light did not. The PA clicked and threaded a voice into the stairwell speakers. Janet, maybe, or a name whose consonants were blurred by age. The voice said nothing useful. It said instead, "Come back," and then a sequence of numbers that matched a timestamp Joey had circled in an old ledger, 0433. The manual's rule to note the time was a cheer in a crowd. The only person in that crowd was me. I walked the floors with a flashlight and a toolbox. The building now made small, precise decisions of its own accord. A vent would exhale a cool gust in a corridor I had just checked. A door would click as if to close on something that had already stepped through it. The tiles above the security room had opened wider than I remembered. The braided bundle I had seen before, wiring and fiber fused with something else, was gone from the duct. The edge of the tile had a crescent smear where the residue had been rubbed away. Joey's satchel strap lay on the floor like the end of a rope. There are few choices in those hours that read like choices at all. You do the job you know until the job you know is no longer a job. You follow the rules until the rules become the only thin fabric between you and a larger hunger. The manual was a set of instructions meant to keep an entity in place. We were, by habit, the people who kept the instructions. That night, the building wanted to teach me what happened when keepers left. The lesson was blunt. The silence in the security room was not empty. It was a held note. The monitors showed static arranged like a sky you could not look at directly. On one screen, the mailroom camera, a silhouette separated from the procession and tilted its head. For the first time, the figure looked as though it were listening. I felt the room change, the air dragging like tape across skin. A speaker somewhere in the building exhaled, and for a fraction, the sound was the voice I had heard on the voicemail. It was not a voice, strictly, but a breath shaped like a name.
I barely remember the decision. I remember the way my fingers felt too big for the keys as I typed a note of the time and the smell, and the way the residue had spread to a strap on a bag. I remember reaching for my jacket, the one with the pocket that had stiffened, and thinking in the rational, mechanistic terms that had always kept me useful. If it is a material contaminant, I can isolate it. I can wash. If it is not, then words are the only trace I can leave. I stuffed Joey's papers into a manila folder and took them with me, because if the thing liked paper and names, then putting his records somewhere contained it felt like a polite theft. I did not find Joey. There was no sign that anyone had been dragged, or that a fight had happened. No overturned chair, no scuffed shoe. The only evidence was the way the building seemed to have reconfigured itself to exclude me from one corridor. The carpet pattern looked wrong, as if the tile had been adjusted, and the small personal things left as punctuation. His cheap cologne in a corner of the security room that took the air like a memory, the folded map with circles drawn around vents, a notebook open to a new page that began, in his tidy hand, with the words, "If it learns names." I left with the manila folder. I left with the manual in its blue plastic folder, though part of me thought to drop it back on the desk and slam the door. I did not. I took the manual because there is a useful superstition in carrying a rulebook with you, like carrying prayer beads in a pocket. The rain felt colder on the way home, as if the city had learned to siphon warmth away. My jacket pocket had another smear on it where I had not noticed before, and when I checked my phone again, there was a second voicemail. 2 seconds of raw sound that could have been static, a breath, a syllable. It played, stopped, and left the impression of intent. For 2 days after that, I did what men with practical training do. I attempted containment at a distance. I scrubbed my jacket and my boots with all the cleaning agents available in a single supermarket. I microwaved my phone wrapped in a towel. Stupid, yes, but it felt like something. I boiled the coffee mugs. I opened windows wide and burned scented oils until the apartment smelled like citrus and bleach. None of it made the voicemail stop. None of it made the smear vanish from the inside seam of the pocket in quite the way I wished.
There were small betrayals, as subtle and terrible as hairline cracks. My apartment light would flicker in rhythm with a particular monitor feed when I turned it on, once in the middle of the afternoon. When I put my hand on the lamp, it would settle and then continue normally. It was a trick on the nerves. A day later, I found a damp arc on my kitchen table, like a crescent, small and precise, as if someone had thumbed the edge of a cup in residue.
The laundromat receipt in my pocket had a smudge across the barcode, as if the residue had decided it liked numbers. The voicemail kept practicing my name. Sometimes it was a near match, sometimes it was a pattern that suggested someone shaping a vowel. The manual said not to speak back, and I obeyed, even when every human impulse wanted to press a reply and demand what it was. You cannot reason with whatever learns names in that building. You can only limit access. I found that out the way people find out most rules in dangerous places, by breaking them elsewhere in hope that they might not apply to you. 3 nights later, the city announced the buyer for the tower. The press release smelled like paint and good intentions. I kept working. The landlord was happy. The courier who'd first given me the folder left me a plastic envelope with a new check inside, a tidy amount for a final sweep before the inspectors came. I was practical. Practicality is sometimes faith dressed as habit. I went back to finish the ledger. I took the manila folder with Joey's papers and the manual, because you are tempted to bring proof into any room that might doubt you. The last night was a collapse of small things into one large moment. The generator hiccuped at the usual hour, but this time the battery bank did not take the load. The emergency systems engaged and a dozen backup circuits blinked through. In the second the building stuttered, the monitors came alive with an image I still see when I close my eyes. The loading dock camera showing a pair of wet shoe prints leading from the darkness, stopping, and then a slow procession of silhouettes filing past the roll-up door like attendants at a wake. They kept perfect rhythm like metronomes wound by someone patient. We did everything the manual said. We cut the interior lights, we turned off the speakers in the stairwells. I copied the time into the ledger with a hand that did not want to tremble. There is a point in training where repetition becomes reflex, and reflex becomes prayer. You do a thing not because you believe it will work, but because the ritual steadies your hands. We did the ritual and still the vents began to breathe. The vent above the server room went silent, and then tugged at the air as if something had taken hold of the building's breath and was measuring it for size. The braided bundle, the thing I had seen the week before, appeared at the seam of a ceiling tile like a plant pushing through a cracked sidewalk. It moved with tactile curiosity, finding the lip of the tile and experimenting with the space below. Then it plunged a thin filament into the security room like a finger. If you are expecting a scream, there is no recorded that I can repeat. There is the sound of a breaker snapping. There is the noise of a door slamming somewhere down the hall.
There is my rational mind trying to call the things by words I know: fiber, cable, condensation, because words keep you from becoming entirely empty. There is Joey's notebook falling open and a page catching on a desk drawer. There is the smell that floods a room like a memory. I did the rule that required not looking directly at silhouettes and not to answer the PA messages, and for a while that kept the dread at a tolerable distance. But rituals are only preventative. They are not guarantees. The filament touched the back of a monitor, and the feed warped as though the camera had been dipped in ink. When the filament withdrew, there was a small smear on the plastic housing of the monitor, like a thumbprint. Later, I would see that smear under a microscope as a lattice of black fibers fused to dust and metal oxidization. Close up, it looked less like a mark and more like a calligraphic tide line. Joey was there, and he did the only thing I had ever seen him do when the building was being honest with us. He read aloud from the binder, not because the words had power, but because reading them kept us obedient. When silhouettes pass, extinguish interior lights. He spoke the rules like a mechanic invoking a torque specification. Do not let it hear your name. He sounded like a Nan quoting the weather. Then his voice stopped. He had been looking up at the ceiling, and the light in his eyes went strange. I turned. For a fraction of a moment, there was a suggestion of panic, the sort you see in someone who realizes a tool has slipped from their hand, and then he was gone. Not dragged, not an obvious event, just not there. The satchel was by the desk, the papers slightly off kilter. The spot on the desk where his elbow had been was warm. I expected shouting, police, something that turned noise into the kind of atmosphere that every city responds to. That did not happen. The building behaved as if it had closed around an annoyance. The PA filled with static. The monitors showed the corridor, and then a blank wall where the procession had been. The ledger lay open with my handwriting alone. There was a final notation in Joey's book, folded over the page where he had been writing. The single word listened into the margin in a hand that might have been his and might not. I left that night with Joe's manila folder and the manual. I did not sleep. I took trains I did not usually take and checked under my jacket like a man guarding a wound. Every so often my phone vibrated and one of those truncated voicemails would arrive. They were getting bolder, longer, a breath, a syllable, a rhythm that approximated my name. I refused to replay them more than once. The manual said, "You do not respond." A week later, I noticed a small thing in my apartment that made me understand entertainment had failed in the most pedestrian of ways.
I found a strip of paper caught in the seam of my jacket pocket when I went to put it on. A sliver of paper with an old payroll stub photocopy on one side, the edges slightly blackened as if exposed to smoke. It was not something I had carried that night. It was not something the courier had given me. It fit into my pocket as if it had always been there, the exact size of Joey's calloused fingers. In the bottom corner, penned in a hurried scrawl that was unmistakably Joey's, someone had written a time and a note. 02:17 a.m. Do not respond. That was the hand that told men to copy dates into ledgers. That was the hand that had loved names and feared them at the same time. It lay in my pocket, damp and cool against my thigh, like a borrowed talisman. On evenings since, the small betrayals continued. A voicemail that sounded like a man clearing his throat, but in the way my building used to clear its throat. A streak of dark residue along the inside of a book I had not taken outside in months. One morning I found a print on the inside of my blinds, a tiny crescent blot, like the edge of a thumb. I keep the windows closed now, and the air fresheners on full blast. I scrub the kitchen table until it shines. None of that makes the sound stop. None of that makes the smear vanish from the inside of my jacket pocket entirely. It fades, it flares, it shifts like a bruise you keep looking at. I have read the binder and the manual until their pages feel like the skin of an instrument, and the rules inside ring like tuned notes. They are simple and short because short instructions are easier to obey when your hands want to shake. I carry them in my head now. They have become a map I can't unlearn. 1. Keep light and sight. Replace bulbs immediately. Cameras notice things that you cannot. 2. Silence phones from designated zones. Do not feed private lines into public speakers. 3. Do not answer PA calls or unfamiliar intercoms. Note times and content. 4. Seal vents when residue appears. Keep physical barriers between conduits and rooms. 5. Do not look long at silhouettes. Turning out lights when they pass reduces attention. 6. Keep a physical log. Copy dates. The pattern repeats roughly every 40 to 60 years. 7. If something attaches to an object you will carry home, isolate and discard that object away from living spaces. I offer the list not as an incantation but as a ledger. Follow it if you ever find yourself hired for a night that pays too well to be ordinary. The last item is practical. If you discover residue on clothing, leave it on site and have someone else launder it far from your home. Joey told me once, half in humor and half in terror, that the building keeps what it can feed, and where it cannot feed, it will look for places that remember the smell of its hair. People ask whether I would go back. There are things I keep because they are necessary, my tools, the comfort of a known route. But there is a difference between returning to a job and returning to a place that wants you as a thing. I am not going back to that office. The city will rezone or the building will be refurbished, and the ledger of its quirks will be folded into another bureaucracy. That does not mean the pattern will cease. Joey had been tracking decades. Patterns do not care for human timelines. As for what followed me home, what I can prove is small but stubborn. The voicemail that tries my name, the smear with a lacework texture on my coffee cup, the damp arc on the inside of my closet door that reappears no matter how often I wash it, the lamp that sometimes flickers when I say a word too close to the phone. That is what following looks like, not an apocalypse at my threshold, but a persistence. The thing came with residues and arguments. It brought with it a way of touching my life in peripheral ways, a hobbyist haunting that plants fragments in the seams of ordinary objects. If there is a moral, it is that we are all practical keepers until the night we are not. We make lists and keep them because lists quiet us. Sometimes a list is enough. Sometimes it is not. I have learned the difference, and I live with it like a dent in a pocket. I keep Joey's notebook and the manual in a fireproof box. I keep a photocopy of the ledger in a drawer in case anyone ever asks questions. I do not publish what happened because publicity is a kind of wind that things like to ride. I am a practical man with practical instincts. I report anomalies to no one who will make it a spectacle. I write this because I have to tell someone who might understand.
The building does not want to be forgotten, and the things it contains do not always stay put. If you find yourself in an empty building at night and you are given a set of brittle rules, follow them. They exist for reasons written in soot and ledger lines. If you hear a voice that sounds like someone you loved, note the time and leave the room. If you see a smear, treat it as material, not metaphor. Beware objects that fit into pockets. The last night in the abandoned office is the one I cannot stop thinking about, because something I thought I left sealed behind that glass and those locked doors found me on the walk home. It did not announce itself with fireworks. It left fingerprints on the rim of my life and practiced saying my name until the sound took on the wrong shape. I live with that now as I live with the city's small betrayals. The flicker, the voicemail, the stain on an old jacket. I wake at odd hours and look at the door and the vents, and I repeat the rules like a man reciting a set of instructions he hopes will become a muscle. There is no neat end to this. There is only the ledger and the habit of checking it. If you ever take a job that pays too well to be ordinary, remember the simple facts. Infrastructure forgets slowly, and things that move through ducts do not always stay in rooms. Keep your locks.
Keep your lights. Keep your silence. And if something ever begins to practice your name on the other end of a speaker, do not answer.